Okay, so in part 2 of lab 4 in the principal component analysis lab, you're going to look at social vulnerability metrics within the census data and understand how we can kind of combine those or collapse that information using principal component analysis to monitor social vulnerability relative to environmental hazards. Okay, so I've provided for you inside of the shared file, lab 4 share in our class drive, several things. So like the geologic map, the Landsat data for part 1. But in part 2, we have census block group data, environmental hazard data. So the census block group data includes all of the block groups, shape files within Utah that you can then append census data to. I required that environmental justice EPA screen census data from their website, downloaded that as a CSV file, and then I've already joined that to the data and kind of simplified that data for you with this Utah BG block group data edited file. So if we turn that on, we'll see it's this the polygon, and then if we look set of polygons and then we look inside, we'll see attributes. And inside of there, I joined by this field GeoID 20. And then in here is the American Community Survey total population within that block group. And then several other things. I provided an attribute information file also within that folder. If you back up to go to the EJ screen census data, you can look at the block group explanation. But the things that you're going to use are the percent minority, percent low income, percent unemployed, percent where English is a challenge, percent less than a high school diploma, percent under the age of 5, percent over the age of 64, and percent living in homes built before 1960 as our kind of metrics for issues of social vulnerability in Utah. Now, there are many other things, of course, that could be issues of social vulnerability, such as percent, say, single head of household, percent female head of household, percent with disability, percent on some sort of social service, etc. But these are the data that were provided in that EJ screen tool, and it's enough variables that they're not all showing us the same thing, and it shows us the value of running a PCA, principal component analysis. Okay, so in addition to that census data, which is put into your Utah block group data edited table here, I've also provided a clipping file, because later in the lab, I'm going to ask you to kind of clip your relationship analysis to kind of urban areas where we have these different features, TRI sites, solid waste facilities, and I've got both things open here, remove that. And the other thing that we have, so if we go back into lab 4 share, the environmental hazards, we have brownfields, solid waste facilities, and TRI sites. Okay. And so we can see that a lot of these are located within urban areas. And so we'll do our analysis in those areas because of that. Now, of course, environmental justice and certainly many socially vulnerable people live in non-urban areas. So if you were to do this sort of project for your research project, you might want to consider the lower populated areas as well. But that presents a challenge with the spatial geography when your block groups are so big. How do you differentiate who's experiencing it within there, who's close by those sites. Okay, so if we go to your lab, basically, I've kind of gone through, yeah, we've got that block group data. I've given you the CSV data, but there was some issues with joining the table, and since I struggled with that, I gave you kind of the result of that already here. So that's this Utah block group data edited file. And then I've given you these 3 feature classes, brownfield sites that have been targeted for cleanup because they're polluted, toxic release inventory sites monitored by the EPA for their air emissions, and then solid waste facilities, which also presents a hazard to the environment. So we open those things. We've joined the table already for you. And the next thing to do is to transform your feature class data into raster data. So to do that, we're going to be basically transforming this Utah block group data edited. And it's as simple as going to Tools and then going, I believe it's Feature to Raster in Conversion Tools. So there it is, Feature to Raster. Now remember, we can batch process these. I don't know how easy that is for this one. Let's check that out for a second. So we could batch parameter based upon the field. Okay, let's see if that's going to work for us. So if we input our census block group data edited, and then we say we want minority percent, low income percent, there's 8 of these, unemployment percent, English not primary language percent, high school or lower than a high school diploma percent, percent under the age of 5, percent over the age of 64, and percent living in old homes. And so then we would call this raster those things. And then now here's the key. So go to environments. Let's output this into a coordinate system that we can understand. And so let's change, let's not use that coordinate system. Let's see what this is giving us. No, those are all world geographic. So let's go to projected coordinate system. Let's go to UTM, NAD83, our usual favorite, zone 12N. Okay, and then we can go back here to the cell size. Let's input these as 100-meter grid cells. So this is even coarser than, say, Landsat, but it's a reasonable pixel size to think about these hazardous things. It's going to create multiple pixels per block group, but that's okay. We're basically rasterizing these block groups. Okay, so let's run that. So over the last couple of labs, we've learned that we can go back and forth, right, between features and rasters. And then, we're still storing that same type of information within the pixels here, but we're kind of separating them out into separate rasters. So they're only one band rasters that are storing one thing, such as minority percentage. And so the raster values are going to be fractions of 1. So I guess it's really the ratio of minorities, not the percentage. But if you multiply by 100, then it would be percentage proper. And you could do that, right, within raster calculator. Okay, so it's running through these. And those are all being saved to a geodatabase for this project. And so keep that in mind. And the other cool thing, right, about these batch processes, everything within here is %name is just going to repeat what was the input. So we'll tie in minority percentage, raster, minority percentage, raster, low income percentage, etc. So that's, really helpful for keeping track of what's going on. Okay. And then here it's spitting them out. Of course, by default, it's giving them some color scheme. And I might not like that color scheme. When we only have one band variable, it's often a really good idea to just kind of keep it simple. And what I like to do, if it show up here on docket, well, that'll help me. But so I would just say we don't want to classify this since it's continuous data. We'll stretch it, and it's going. Let's turn off ones we're not looking at here. It doesn't have to display everything every time. Okay, so yeah, so their percent built before 1960. And so how do you want this to look? I guess, maybe it's slightly, I guess, more common to say that it's going to be the higher values here is worse conditions. So worse conditions are often shown with darker colors, like, and so if we zoom into Salt Lake City, for instance, the older parts of the city are older buildings, so that's what's going to show up. Newer parts, right, in these suburban areas are going to be lighter in color if we invert it that way. Yeah. So that makes sense. Let's look at a different one. So if we go here to raster over 64, so where old people living that might be at a retirement age, potentially vulnerable, go to symbology, change to stretch it, and then we will invert this again. So more old people, it's going to show up as darker. So this is a little bit more heterogeneous. Where is it the older folks are living? But there are some areas that it's kind of more concentrated. If we were to go to the whole state, yeah, that's what I thought. If we go down to St. George, that's definitely a retirement hub. Okay. Interestingly, out on some reservation lands out here too. Okay, so let's go through there and basically change these all to be stretched and the same color scheme, percent of really young people. So here you can see that there's a lot of places in Utah County, especially in these kind of expanding suburbs where that is really the case. And you might say, well, why is that a vulnerable population? Well, it's a lot of people in the household that don't earn an income and can't speak for themselves. So those are vulnerable populations. Okay, so let's again go to the next one. Less than a high school diploma. No, not properties. We want to go to symbology for each of these. Sorry, and go to stretched. Talk myself through it. Invert this again. Okay, so can see that downtown Salt Lake has some of these populations, some areas in northern Utah County. We zoom further out, some of these rural counties have a lot of people that don't finish their high school degrees. turn on a language being an issue, not having access to English language in the household. So again, stretch, vert. Okay, so generally this is can see a pretty low value, but there are some areas, right? And so this would likely be percent potentially with immigrant populations, but that's not what it's showing exactly. Oh, and then also, you know, we did, by default, it goes to percent clip for the stretch type. You could play around with that. Standard deviation might be more informative. If you want to know where this is more the case than typical, as opposed to percent clip. But really, you know, we kind of also just want the minimum and maximum range to show over the data. But if we want the way it's shown to show us where there's difference, then standard deviations is a good visualization. So you could go back through and change that. Percent unemployment. So in some places gets up to 40% unemployment, and those are more rural areas, generally speaking, although there are pockets of census block groups where this is an issue in the urban area as well. Low income, symbology, change it back to stretch, invert it. And yeah, I'll go back to standard deviation. So percent low income, we can see communities right along State Street in Utah County, southern Provo into some of the areas down near the Provo Bay. And then if we go into downtown Salt Lake in the low areas near the Jordan River and other areas is a higher percent of low income populations. And then percent minority is our last one here. Let's go back to stretch, vert, and go to standard deviations. And can see that there's some strong correlations, right, between some of these input data sets. Okay, so display each of your census vulnerability raster data sets similarly, i.e. dark to light, which we just did, so they can see where in Utah there are block groups with worse off conditions. Consider whether or not think there's a general overlap amongst the metrics. So you might take the time to like put a side-by-side layout together to show these things. Now that we've got these as separate these are all raster data. I know they still look like the block groups, but now they're pixels, right? So they're rasters. So we could now do our principal component analysis on them as well. Okay, so yeah, let's run that. So go to tools, just like we did in part 1. And that is located let's back up. So in spatial analyst, multivariate tools, it's principal components. And so when we do this, we need to be really careful. And I didn't emphasize this enough in the first tutorial, that we note exactly the order that we put these things in. And I'm going to say that we should put them in the order they appear in the original data table, which was, that way we'll remember. But you could also write this down in your notes or on your lab. So percent minority, percent low income, percent unemployment, percent of language being an issue, high school diploma, under 5, over 64, and old housing. And so then you're going to output a principal component raster, PCA Utah vulnerability, I'll call it. And you should also output a data file by the same name. And we're inputting 8 components, and that'll spit out 8 principal components. But the first 4 or so will be kind of all of the information we need, is the whole idea. So we can go ahead and run that. And so the weird thing is that this is going to produce a PCA that's going to be a multi-band red, green, blue raster. It's going to show the top 3 principal components. And this, I think, can be confusing to look at. I've got a whole blurb about this here. So consider that, like I said, so if we were to look, if you read through this, the red is going to be your primary principal component 1, the green would be 2, the blue would be 3. So if you get the output map and you see a lot of blue, then you know that area was sensitive to principal component 3. If you look within the table of the principal component analysis that you also produced, you can see what of the input variables were strongly correlated with each of these principal components. And so you might be able to infer what those areas that show up as blue mean, or red mean, or green mean. Or if you have areas where multiple things are related, then you're going to end up getting colors that are kind of a combination of some color theory. But yeah, it's a little bit tricky to look at. I think my mind tends to work better in one variable at a time. And so the whole idea about the principal components is that we've collapsed a lot of variables into the first component. So I might plot side by side the most important components in like a 3 layout map. Principal component 1 next to 2 next to 3, which is going to have like 90% of your data variance in it. Because otherwise, yeah, you're looking at this and you're like, okay, what does red mean? What does blue mean? It's not intuitive to me. So instead, you can go to symbology and you can go back to stretch. And band 1 is principal component 1. And we can invert it again. The higher values are going to be the more vulnerable. And go to standard deviations. So we can see if we zoom in on Salt Lake, the darker areas here are going to be classified as more vulnerable. The lighter areas, less vulnerable. And so if we were to compare this principal component 1 map to the other individual maps, we'll see that the light areas are kind of more muted and gray. And then the dark areas maybe are not all that different because they're a combo. So let's turn off these sites because this will help us. So this is a low income percentage. So the dark areas of low income are really prominent here in this bottom of Salt Lake City area. So we can compare that low income to just the principal component 1, which probably is related to low income, but it's probably related to something else because some of these other ones are showing up as dark. But the lighter areas kind of got other colors now because there's other factors of vulnerability. Maybe those weren't low income areas, but maybe they're older people. And so there's some added vulnerability from that area of the data. Okay, yeah, so that's your principal component analysis. Just to kind of emphasize that, if we go into the data table that outputs, and if we were to drag this open, what we see at the bottom is that the principal component 1, which I'm displaying, accounts for 48% of the variance. So it's not as high as it could be. Second component is another 22% for a total of 70% of the variance. And the third is 14% for a total of 85. And so really to get most of the variance, you need to go to 4 or 5 principal components here. And that's because, of course, some things are not related. So where you have a lot of people over 65, you don't have a lot of people under 5. And where you have a lot of people over 65, they're not necessarily poor. And so if we look at this table above it, we can kind of get a sense of how the principal component layer right here, number 1, compares to the input layers. So the first input layer was minority percentage, and this 0.87 for correlation. And so, yeah, it is strongly correlated with percent minority. Percent low income is 0.3. That's the second most strongly correlated. Beyond that, it was entry number 5, and I can't remember what that is, so I'd have to go back and look, right? Yeah, and so then if you look at principal component 2, you see it's not strongly correlated. It's actually anti-correlated with percent minority, but it is strongly correlated with percent low income and this last one, which is older homes. And then the third component is again strongly correlated with percent low income, but then the other correlation is the next one, which I can't remember. Yeah, and so looking at these values, you're basically understanding if it's positively correlated with that principal component layer. And so as you interpret it, so if we look at number 1, we can see it's kind of the input layer 1, 2, 4, 5, and 8, which are playing a role. Oh, not 8. So, sorry, that's negative. 1, 2, 4, and 5. If we get to number 2, it's 8 and 2, and maybe 3 and 5. And as we get to number 3, it's 2 and 3, but not the others. And as principal component 4, it's 2, 4, and 6. So yeah, think about that. Try to wrap your head around that a bit if you can. Okay, so you've created those figures. It says clip the PCA and other rasters that you made to the urban areas next. And so you can do a batch clip. So clip raster. So if we go to data management tools, clip raster, batch by input raster. So now we'd want to clip each one of these things, the Utah vulnerability, PCA, each of these other ones. The order that I put these in doesn't matter because the output names are going to be tied to them. Should have 9 of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And the output extent is going to be the clipping area, which is the urban clip dissolve, which I provided you, and use the input features with the clipping geometry. And then, so we're just going to call it clip and then percent name. Run. So this make things a bit smaller and simpler to deal with. So that's running look ahead. So we clip those and then we'll have this we're going to then kind of create buffers around the the sites of environmental hazards, and we're going to query the clipped rasters in terms of the values of the rasters within those buffers. And so that'll allow us to look at the environmental relationship to the social vulnerability. Okay. Let me explain about the buffers while that's going on. Close this table and this one. Let's see more. So if I turn on, basically I've given you points of pollution sites. So if we zoom in, you can see that we have a few different things going on here. Might be useful to like reattribute these. So the TRIs, we have these, maybe not black, red circles. And then could get, my rasters are popping out now. Zoom out so we can see them. You might consider grouping these to make things easier to keep track of. Okay. So I'm just going to re-symbolize these for a second. So red triangles, so maybe we make them gray whatevers, and then crosses, no. Open diamonds, no. I guess we kind of just don't have a lot of choices here. Yellow stars, oof, it's everywhere. Okay, well, whatever, we're gonna get rid of those in a minute. Let's turn off some of these weirdo things. Okay. Don't want to draw everything every time. Okay, so this is percent minority. Oh, lovely. It's inverted everything on me again. So it's gone my previous symbology. It's inverted everything. Remember or you need to invert it, change it to standard deviations. So anyways, we can see percent minorities where now it's darker after I've inverted it. And then where these things are. So the solid waste specific facilities in stars, the TRI sites in red circles, the brownfield targeted sites are not showing up very well like that. So maybe we'll make them red circles with a dot inside of them. So there's some as well, but not as many of those. And so I guess for the buffers, what I suggest is this. So first, I would go ahead and merge all of those because we're not, for this, we're just going to treat them all the same. The reality is they have different toxic hazards, and if we're going to be sophisticated about this, we do something different. But for now, we're not. We're just going to put in each of these point facilities, and we're going to treat them the same. So TRI, solid waste, and targeted, merge them all together into one data set. And so we could just call it merged hazards if you want. Okay, so there's my merged. Ooh, didn't keep all of the sites, did it? That didn't work out. Remove. Okay. Okay. Actually, let's not do it in this order. So don't start with merge. So first thing we'll do then is we'll do the buffers, because the buffers will give us very generic fields, and then we'll merge those later. Okay, so um, search for buffer. And so what we're gonna do is actually do uh, a batch. So the batch will be the input features. So we go next. And so we'll input each of the features, brownfields, solid waste, and the TRIs. And we'll create buffers around each one. And then we can call it like buffer 025 for 0.25 miles within those sites. So the name will be after it. And then we'll dissolve them into a single feature. Okay. Dissolve all into a single feature. Okay, run. So we should get outside of that basically buffers that will sit on top of each of those things. So, and they've made these buffers transparent so we can see through them and see that it worked. So that's nice. So now if we open up the attribute table for any one of these, we'll see that it's just one field. That's really nice. And there's not much there, right? So then you can do this. So you could go tools. Now you could just keep running with the buffers, but we could go back to merge and input each of the buffer features. I think this will work better now. And buffer 0.25 merge. Okay. Now run. We should get another data set that's for all of that. Make it yellow. Shows up everywhere if we turn off. Yeah, all of those blues are covered. Okay, so, and then you can also see you see how there's some overlap in them? And then the next thing we need to do beyond dissolve is merge is dissolve. So let's do that. Dissolve. So we input the merge and we call it merge dissolve, and we create multi-part features. Now they're all combined as one feature. Okay. And so those are radial buffers out from the sites within 0.25 miles of all those features. And so if you want, once you're done with these things, you could remove those intermediary steps. And then we go back and we would do something else. So we would go back to buffer again, back to our favorites, batch buffer. So input the TRI, the brownfields, and the solid waste facilities again. This time we'll call it buffer half a mile, 0.5, but add MI if you want. And then 0.5 miles. And again, we want to make sure to dissolve the fields. It's just one thing, keep it simple. And we run them again. And so you could set up a model builder here, since you kind of have a routine that you'd be going through. It would make this even smoother. So now you can see we have bigger areas around those same facilities. Okay, so then we go back. Okay, what's the next thing we did? Oh, we merged all those. So we input the buffer 05 TRI brownfields, and we merge them all together. Buffer merge. Don't need the TRI in there. Don't know why it shows up. Okay, run. And then we dissolve. So input the buffer merge to buffer merge dissolve, create multiple features. And then get rid of those intermediate steps. Don't get rid of the 0.525. Those. And so there we can see our larger kind of string of areas of these sites that are within half a mile of one of these toxic facilities. And so you keep doing this for 1 mile, for 2 miles, and then we're going to do some extraction of kind of spatial zonal statistics to see what is the value of some of either the overall social vulnerability index from the PCA or from individual things such as percent minority. How does it vary percent minority within half a mile, within 2.25 miles, within 1 mile, within 2 miles? And then in the broader scheme of things, how does it look? So let me show you one other thing, because some of you may want to do this as you go. I want to know everybody within 0.25 miles, everybody within 0.5. Well, you could get more detailed. You could say, actually, I only want to know within 0.25 and then the next 0.25, which is really a kind of a donut, right? So how do you kind of not recalculate this or re-include the people within 0.25? And so that would be, I believe it's called erase. Okay, so we would input the 0.5 and we would erase the 0.25, and then we'd call that buffer 025205. And it can keep merge dissolve, I guess. So if you didn't want to see the part interior, we just want to see who's living just a little further out, then that's what you'd look at. Once you, well, let me just show you one more thing. So go back to tools. Let's do the 2-mile buffer. So batch buffer again. Go back to the original facilities. This one's going to be 2 miles. And buffer 2 miles. Facilities. Remember again to dissolve, run. After that, we're going to see that these are big. Merge those all together to the 2 miles. It's going to take you some time. Run the merge. And then after the merge is done, dissolve. That silly TRI thing. Merge, dissolve, 2-mile buffer. And then I can remove those intermediary steps. that covers a lot of the landscape, right? So once you get out 2 miles, this is the urban area is pretty constrained. You're kind of looking at basically what is it where urban population is. Um, so whether or not, I guess you choose to go to 2 miles, or maybe we should stop at 1 mile. Yeah, let me change this to create a 0.25, 0.5, and 1 mile buffer. Okay. Yeah, I think within 1 mile is good enough. Okay, so actually let's remove that because that's not so good. Let's go back to batch buffer, input our target features, 1 mile, and then buffer 1 mile, dissolve yes. Okay, so that is a little more discriminating. Merge those. Then dissolve those. The TRI, because it's everything. Remove the intermediate steps. Okay, so there we go. So we have this half-mile buffer. We have the 0.25 mile buffer, half-mile buffer, and the 1 mile buffer shown here. You could also go with the small donut, and you could also do that between 1 and 0.5. But let's just say we have kind of these three. But then we have everywhere else. So if we add in this kind of what we called the urban area, which we just clipped everything to, we would want to see kind of how do these areas near the hazardous waste sites compare with areas that are not near it. And so then we might want to do another erase. Let's search erase again. And in this case, we take the urban clip dissolve and erase it by the 1 mile dissolve merged and run that. So what are the values everywhere else, basically, is the question. Then if we turn this off, we can see these are the areas that aren't sitting within a mile of a toxic release site. Okay, so great. So that allows us to we've created those buffers. And then what you have to do is use zonal statistics to determine the mean percentage of that metric within each of the 5 geographies. So I guess it's 4 geographies now. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'll just show you what this looks like for greater than 1 mile, and then what it looks like for 0.25 miles for comparison. So actually, we can do it all at once, right? So again, zonal statistics, but run it as a batch process. So zonal statistics is in spatial analyst tools. Zonal statistics is a table. So we can input if we go back, right click, run as a batch. And so the input zonal area is going to be our batch. So that's our far out, our 1 mile, our half mile, and our quarter mile buffers. And then we're just going to ask for the mean values for some raster. And so I guess I'll do it for the vulnerability. So the higher the value here, the more vulnerable. So let's see if the relationship holds. Oh, it failed. Let's see, where is this being saved? Or no data, mean, zonal. Oh, well, we should be careful here. We want it to be zonal for PCA values, so we know what's going on. So maybe it's a good thing it failed. Hopefully it runs now. Seems to be running. I switched to object ID. So then it spits out some tables, right? And so we can look at those, and then we can fill out our own table here. So if we open the far out PCA, the mean value for the first principal component at a far out distance is 0.34. Within 1 mile, it's 0.44. Remember, the higher, the more vulnerable. Within a half mile, it's 0.47. And within a quarter mile, it's 0.49. So again, see quite a difference. If we look over the range here, how does that look? It's a good question. Really, we'd kind of look at the histogram, right, of the values. And we showed me that a bit better, but so 0.34 is here. 0.49 is there. So there's some very vulnerable areas beyond that. But this is, again, the average within there. So it's a mix of things. But generally, trend going up to worse, more vulnerable, the closer you get to the hazard. So, I mean, this is a classic environmental justice issue. The most vulnerable populations tend to be situated closest to the environmental hazard. And so you should do this for your principal component analysis. And this is going to make maybe even more sense to you when you look at the percentage of minority populations living closest and further away, do at least 3 of these. And so then from there, you're going to go on and produce these things and address these questions. I want to know which interrelated aspects of the 8 vulnerability issues examined contributed positively to the first principal component in your analysis. So remember, we looked at that in the table for the PCA output. And then describe generally what are the areas in Utah that have the greatest levels of social vulnerability according to your principal component number 1. So that can be done at a Utah scale. Where are the vulnerable places in terms of people? And then what is the relationship between distance environmental hazards, PC1, and the 3 census vulnerability metrics that you examined? So describe what the outputs from this table are. So to answer those questions, you should present these figures. A figure comparing each of the top 3 principal components with captions about the contributing factors. See step 6 above. A summary description or a table about the principal component analysis. This could be included within the captions of the step 6 figure or as a separate table. So basically, I want you to describe what of the input 8 variables are captured within the first couple of principal components. And that you can show me in those correlation matrix of the table that they output. You have to present your table right here above and describe it. Probably should have a caption for the table. And then you should have a related example map that probably has inset maps as necessary to show the geographies of vulnerability to environmental hazards in Utah. So if we were to maybe turn off some of these things, go back to an overview map here. These are our hazardous sites, and there are our vulnerable populations in terms of percent minority. You could make some overlays, percent minority, percent low income. Oh, don't forget to make sure the symbology is all the same. So there's percent low income. Percent minority and percent low income aren't a one-to-one correlation. Etc. We're going to see different things in different areas. So yeah, I want you to show some map outputs about that as well. Okay, yeah, this is the end of this tutorial. Hopefully this has been helpful.